Have you ever wondered if peace is possible? Not in some distant future, but here, within the life you're already living. What if the end of suffering isn't about changing the world, but about changing how you see it? Beneath the noise of craving, fear, and resistance lies a stillness that has never left you. Enlightenment isn't an escape, it's a return to what has always been here, quietly waiting behind every breath. Welcome to Trandy Wisdom, where every story is a compelling truth. In a world filled with endless motion, where we chase success, escape pain, and grasp for happiness, there comes a quiet question. Is there another way to live? For thousands of years, the Buddha's answer has remained gentle and unwavering. Yes, there is a path that leads beyond suffering, not by denying it, but by walking through it, with eyes open and heart awake. This episode invites you on that journey. A journey not to the mountaintop, but inward, to the still ground beneath your feet. We will explore how suffering becomes the seed of awakening, and how true freedom blossoms not from resistance, but from understanding. Let the story unfold, not just in your ears, but in your breath, your silence, your presence. Let's begin. 1. The suffering we carry. The burden of everyday pain. There is a kind of ache that no medicine can touch. A quiet, persistent weight that we carry in the chambers of the heart. It does not always cry out. It doesn't always have a name, but it is there. In the sigh that escapes after a long day. In the silence between words at the dinner table. In the way we stare at a screen late into the night, hoping to feel something real. This is not the suffering of a broken leg or an open wound. It is the suffering of being human, the suffering of wanting, of losing, of not knowing who we are in a world that never stops spinning. In the teachings of the Buddha, this kind of suffering is not a mistake. It is not a personal failure. It is the very starting point of awakening. The Buddha's path begins not in a distant monastery, not in the heights of philosophy, but in the raw, honest recognition of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, unease, suffering. He invited us not to run from it, but to look deeply, to cradle it like a wounded child. Imagine a woman sitting alone at the edge of her bed, staring at the dim morning light. Her house is quiet, but inside her, a storm rages. Her children have grown distant, her marriage hollowed by routine. She scrolls through images on her phone, smiling faces, exotic destinations, perfect lives. A soft pain stirs. She does not scream. She simply swallows it. Again. Or a young man walking the city at night, music in his ears, hands buried in his pockets. He is surrounded by people, but feels completely alone. He keeps himself busy, works hard, plays harder, yet feels a hole inside that nothing seems to fill. He tells himself he is fine. But in the silence between songs, in the pause before sleep, the weight is there. The Buddha saw this over 1,500 years ago, under the Bodhi tree. He did not discover a new religion. He awakened to a truth that had always been there. That life, when clung to, is filled with dissatisfaction. Even joy, when grasped too tightly, turns into fear. Fear of loss, fear of change. And so he taught not to escape the world, but to see it clearly. He taught that we suffer not simply because things are hard, but because we resist the impermanence of all things. We want to hold on. We want things to stay, but nothing does. Each of us carries our own constellation of suffering. It is shaped by our childhood, our culture, our memories, and our hopes. For one person, it may be the ache of abandonment. For another, the guilt of something left undone. There are those who suffer from being too visible, and those who suffer from being unseen. Sometimes we think suffering has to be dramatic to be real, but often it is the subtle ache that shapes our lives the most. A mother stands at the kitchen sink, washing dishes with tears in her eyes, remembering a conversation that hurt. A student stares at their own reflection, hearing the echo of a cruel word spoken years ago. A man smiles at a party, but his laughter is thin. His heart is tired. These are the small heartbreaks we carry. They live in the body, in the tension in our shoulders, the clench of our jaw, the shallow breath we never noticed. What the Buddha offered was not a promise to erase suffering, but a path to understand it. He taught that when we stop running, when we sit down and breathe with our pain, we begin to untie the knots. That is why the first step of the Four Noble Truths is not to reject suffering, but to embrace it as a teacher. In this light, suffering is not an enemy. It is a doorway. Many people think enlightenment is a state of perfect happiness. But the Buddha's enlightenment began with seeing clearly the nature of pain. When he sat beneath the Bodhi tree, he wasn't seeking a blissful escape. He was seeking the truth of why we suffer and how we might stop. And what he found was astonishing in its simplicity, that craving leads to suffering, that resistance deepens it, and that letting go, deep, compassionate letting go, can bring peace. But how do we let go? We begin by looking, not with judgment, not with the mind of a critic, but with the eyes of a loving mother. When you feel anger rising, breathe. When you feel sorrow settling in your chest, breathe. Name it. Hold it gently. This is not weakness. It is the strongest thing we can do. To stop fighting our pain and to listen to it. To listen means to ask, what is this pain trying to show me? What longing lies beneath it? What illusion is it calling me to release? Maybe the pain is reminding us that we are holding on too tightly to control. Maybe it is whispering that we have been disconnected from our deepest values. Or perhaps it is simply asking us to slow down, to touch the miracle of being alive, right here, right now, in this breath. Mindfulness is not a technique. It is a way of being. When we bring our full presence to this moment, even if it hurts, we begin to reclaim our lives from the fog of numbness. We begin to see that pain is not a punishment. It is key to the invitation to awaken. In the stillness of a quiet morning, you may feel it, the aching beauty of being human. A tear, perhaps, will come, and instead of pushing it away, you let it fall. You smile, you breathe, and you realize that in this gentle act of turning toward your own heart, something has already changed. You are no longer running. You are home. And in that homecoming, suffering loses its power to define you. It becomes not a prison, but a teacher, not a curse, but a companion on the path. The burden lightens, not because it disappeared, but because you are no longer carrying it alone. You have made peace with it. You have seen it with eyes of understanding. This is the beginning of freedom, not loud, not grand, just a breath, just a step. But it is real, and it is yours. 2. The awakening. When pain becomes a doorway. There are moments in life when something breaks, not outside, but within. A silence, a pause, a breath held too long. It might come after loss, or betrayal, or simply a quiet evening when the noise of the world falls away, and all that is left is a question. Why am I still not at peace? Such a moment is not the end. It is an invitation. In the stillness that suffering creates, something sacred can begin to stir. Not the quick fix of distraction, not the shallow comfort of certainty, but a deeper movement, the kind that pulls us gently inward. It is here, in the heart of despair, that awakening begins, not as a lightning strike from the heavens, but as a soft knocking on the door of our awareness. We do not usually seek truth when things are going well. Comfort rarely calls us to question our lives, but pain does. Pain forces us to stop, to feel, to see. There was once a man who built his life on precision. His days were measured, efficient, successful by every standard. But one night, he found himself sitting in his parked car long after the engine had gone silent. A wave of emptiness had washed over him at the sight of an old photograph, his childhood face, smiling without effort. And suddenly, he could not remember the last time he had smiled like that. Something inside collapsed. He did not speak of this to anyone. Instead, the next day he found himself walking aimlessly through a quiet park, no destination in mind. He sat by a tree. He listened to the wind, and for the first time in years, he felt his breath. That was not his breakdown. That was his awakening. Awakening often begins in secret. The world might not notice, but inside, the walls begin to shift. Where we once only saw blame, we start to sense patterns. Where we once pointed outward, we begin to turn inward, and not with judgment, but with curiosity, with care. What if my suffering is not a punishment? We ask. What if it is a message? The Buddha taught that suffering is not the enemy. It is the beginning of understanding. The first noble truth is not a condemnation, but a mirror. It reflects what we already know. Deep down, that life, when grasped too tightly, becomes painful. That the things we chase do not last. That the roles we perform can become masks that suffocate the soul. But he did not stop there. He went on to uncover the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, craving, clinging, ignorance. Like trying to hold water in a clenched fist, our attempts to control and possess the impermanent only deepen our pain. We want to be liked, to be needed, to be safe, to be right. And in the name of these wants, we exhaust ourselves. Yet, beneath this exhaustion lies a tenderness, a longing not for more, but for realness. The third noble truth offers this. Suffering can end, not through escape, not through perfection, but through release. When we stop running from our pain, when we meet it with presence, it begins to dissolve, not all at once, sometimes just a little. A softening, a breath. The fourth noble truth maps a path, the noble eightfold path. But it is not a ladder to climb. It is a circle of mindfulness, of ethical living, of seeing clearly and acting with compassion. It is less about doing and more about being. Walking this path is not about reaching a destination. It is about walking differently. Imagine walking through a forest. At first, you are preoccupied, lost in thought, in memory, in planning. The trees are just scenery. The wind is background noise. But then, something shifts. Maybe it's the way the light filters through the leaves. Maybe it's a bird call that catches your attention. You pause, you breathe, and suddenly, you are there. Not in the past, not in the future, but in this precise moment. The forest opens. You are no longer walking through it. You are part of it. That is the spirit of awakening. It is not reserved for saints or mystics. It happens in kitchens and subways, in whispered prayers and sleepless nights. It begins when we stop numbing ourselves, when we stop pretending, when we dare to feel what is really there. Some people describe awakening as a falling away. Old narratives collapse. The story we tell about who we are loses its grip, and in its place, a vast quiet emerges, not empty, but spacious. This quiet does not erase pain. It transforms our relationship to it. We stop being afraid of our own hearts. There is a woman who began her mornings in silence, not to be spiritual, but because she could no longer bear the noise. One day, as she sipped tea beside her window, she watched a small bird hopping across the sill. It wasn't singing. It wasn't flying. It was just being. And suddenly, tears came to her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. She too had the right to simply be. That moment was a doorway. Awakening is not one grand moment. It is thousands of small ones. The breath you return to when anxiety rises. The kind word you speak instead of the sharp one. The moment you realize you can let go without losing anything that matters. It is a way of coming home, not to a place, but to your own presence. The pain we once tried to bury becomes compost for wisdom. The questions we once feared become lanterns. We begin to trust the ground beneath us, even when it trembles. We learn to walk with uncertainty, not as a curse, but as a companion. Awakening doesn't mean life stops being difficult. It means we meet life differently, with eyes open, with a heart that listens, with a mind that no longer needs to know everything in order to be at peace. And most importantly, awakening reminds us that we are not alone. The pain you feel has been felt before. The path you walk has been walked before. And every step, however faltering, is a step toward freedom. So when pain knocks again, and it will open the door, not to fight, not to fix, but to listen. Because sometimes, suffering is not a wall to break through. It is a gate. And when we walk through with mindfulness, with compassion, and with courage, we do not escape life. We begin to truly live it. 3. The path within. The practice of inner transformation. It begins not with a vow, nor with a destination. It begins with a pause, a single breath, a moment of stillness that arrives in the middle of noise, not to interrupt, but to reveal. We stop, and for the first time we listen, not to the world outside, but to the world within. There is no ceremony announcing the beginning of the path, no flashing light, no chorus of angels. Sometimes there is only silence, or perhaps a subtle ache in the chest that says something must change. But the change the heart longs for is not out there, in the shape of new achievements or distant retreats. The real journey begins inside. The path within is not a road paved with certainty. It is more like a winding forest trail that reveals itself step by step. Each footfall is an invitation to be present. Each breath is a returning home. To walk this path is to become intimate with your own mind. At first, this can be unsettling. When we stop running, we begin to see the dust we've stirred up, old wounds, forgotten fears, restless thoughts. They all surface. The mind becomes like a stirred-up pond, murky and unsettled. But if we simply sit and allow it to be, the sediment begins to settle. Clarity returns. This is the gift of mindfulness, not to fix, not to control, but to be with what is. To sit with our pain like we would sit with a crying child, not to hush it with distraction, but to hold it with compassion. In the quiet of meditation, we learn to feel again. The breath enters and leaves. The body rises and falls. Sensations appear, then vanish. Thoughts come and go, like clouds drifting through a sky that doesn't cling. And slowly, we begin to understand. We are not our thoughts. We are not our emotions. We are the space in which they appear. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. One man, once tormented by anger, began to sit each morning for just 10 minutes. At first, he fought himself. His mind raced. His body fidgeted. But he returned again and again, until one morning, the anger came, and he did not react. He simply breathed with it. He watched it. And in watching so, he saw it for what it was, a flare of pain, not a permanent truth. That day, he did not lash out. He walked away, calmly. He said nothing, and in his silence, he felt more powerful than he ever had. This is the quiet revolution of inner transformation. It does not look impressive on the outside. There are no medals for the ego to wear. But inside, something is shifting, something far more enduring than applause. To practice is to build a sanctuary within yourself, a place untouched by praise or blame, a place that listens before it speaks, that breathes before it reacts. It is not always peaceful. Some days, the storm outside will find its way in. But when we have learned to anchor ourselves to the present moment, we no longer drown in every wave. On this path, discipline is not a harsh command, but a gentle returning. We fall away. We forget. But then we remember and return again. The bell rings, and we breathe. The sunlight hits the floor just right, and we pause. The child in us cries out, and instead of shaming it, we kneel beside it with love. There are many practices, and all are doors. Walking meditation teaches us that every step can be sacred. Washing dishes becomes an act of reverence. Drinking tea becomes a moment of communion. The ordinary becomes luminous, not because the world changes, but because we begin to see with eyes unclouded by habit. As we transform, the world around us begins to feel different, not because others change, but because our reactions soften. Where we once saw enemies, we begin to see suffering. Where we once closed our hearts, we begin to open them, tentatively, yes, but open nonetheless. Compassion becomes a natural response, not a forced one, because we have seen our own fear, our own pettiness, our own longing. We can now hold others in their imperfection. We no longer demand purity from the world. We offer presence. One evening, a woman lit a candle before her meditation. As she sat in silence, she watched the flame flicker and burn. In that small fire, she saw her mind, bright, but easily disturbed. She realized she couldn't control the wind, but she could protect the flame. That night, she wept, not out of despair, but out of recognition. For the first time, she understood that her job was not to change the world, but to tend to the light within her. This tending is the heart of practice. It is not glamorous. It is often invisible. But it is how forests are planted, how rivers are cleared, how hearts are healed, one breath at a time. We begin to see the patterns of our suffering not as chains, but as maps. Each wound points to a place where love has not yet touched. Each reaction is a signpost to something unhealed. And so we do not reject our anger, our jealousy, our sadness. We bow to them. We study them. We ask, what are you trying to protect? What are you afraid to lose? Transformation is not about becoming someone new. It is about becoming more fully yourself, not the self you've performed to be accepted, but the self that watches, that feels, that knows, the self that is at home in stillness. And in that stillness, we begin to taste a different kind of joy, not the fleeting joy of excitement, but the deep joy of presence, of being here, of knowing that this moment, just as it is enough, that the breath you are taking now is a gift, that the silence between words can be sacred. That peace is not something to seek, but something to uncover, like a spring hidden beneath the rubble of striving. The path within is not easy. It asks for honesty, for humility, for patience, but it is a path that leads to freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever we want, but the freedom to no longer be at war with ourselves. And when we are no longer at war within, we begin to bring peace wherever we go. 4. The realization of freedom, awakening to the end of suffering. There comes a moment on the path when you are no longer searching, not because you have found all the answers, but because the questions themselves have softened. You sit, and it is enough. You breathe, and it is enough. The world does not suddenly become perfect, but your way of seeing it, of being in it, transforms. Freedom, it turns out, was never far away. It was in the space between thoughts, in the silence before speech, in the gentle pause where reaction might have been. It waited in the body, in the chest, rising and falling, in the touch of wind on your cheek. And when you finally stopped striving, stopped reaching for another moment, another version of yourself, you saw it, not as something new, but as something always there, quietly waiting to be remembered. The end of suffering is not the end of pain. It is the end of being bound by it. It is the end of the illusion that we are separate, that we must grasp and guard and defend the self at all costs. True freedom begins when the self begins to dissolve, not into nothingness, but into the vastness of life itself. Imagine sitting by a still lake in the early hours, before sunrise. The world has not yet stirred, and everything is cloaked in soft shadow. You are alone, but not lonely. The stillness is not empty. It is full of presence, of listening, of quiet truth. A bird calls. The surface of the water ripples, and you do not chase the sound or the motion. You simply notice. You are not the center of the scene. You are a part of it. This is what it means to wake up. To awaken is not to escape the human experience, but to enter it fully, without clinging, without resistance. It is to walk through life with open hands, no longer trying to catch the rain, but feeling it fall, tasting it on your tongue, letting it pass. You begin to notice that suffering once came, not from pain itself, but from the fight against it, from wanting it to go, from labeling it wrong, from fearing its return. But when you breathe with pain, without resistance, it changes shape. It becomes a companion, a teacher, even a doorway. The person who once feared loneliness now finds nourishment in solitude. The one who once clung to praise and shrank from criticism now moves with steadiness, rooted in something deeper than approval. Where there was once reactivity, there is response. Where there was once chaos, there is rhythm. Freedom is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It hums, low and steady, like a river beneath the soil. You feel it when you say no with love, when you say yes with clarity, when you choose to pause rather than react, when you hold silence as gently as you hold a newborn. It appears in small choices, in not checking the phone the moment you wake, in listening without planning what to say next, in offering kindness even when no one sees. These are not dramatic gestures. They are the signs of a heart that no longer needs to prove its worth. The awakening to this freedom often comes in still moments. A man sits beside the hospital bed of someone he loves, knowing the end is near. He does not distract himself. He does not escape. He breathes and holds the hand and lets tears come. And in that moment, with death in the room, he feels more alive than he ever has. A woman walks home through a light rain. Her shoes are soaked, the sky gray. Years ago, she would have cursed the weather, rushed inside, complained to someone, but today, she does not run. She stops. She laughs. And in the sound of her own laughter, in the wetness on her skin, she feels free. These are not metaphors. They are lived experiences, signs of a consciousness no longer imprisoned by craving or fear. To be awake is to live without armor, not because the world is safe, but because you have made peace with not being protected, because you know that pain cannot destroy what is true in you, because you have seen, again and again, that everything comes and goes, except awareness itself, and awareness is where your freedom lives. This realization does not always come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the middle of chopping vegetables, or standing in line, or washing your hands. You suddenly realize you are not in a hurry. You are not waiting for life to begin. You are not chasing the next thing. You are here, and it is enough. The end of suffering, then, is not a dramatic escape. It is a subtle shift, from grasping to receiving, from resisting to resting, from isolation to interbeing. You begin to see that there is no separate self to protect, no image to maintain. The tight identity you once clung to begins to loosen. You become more fluid, more responsive, more kind. You do not disappear. You become vast, and in that vastness, forgiveness becomes possible, not as a performance, but as a natural expression of freedom, not because the past didn't hurt, but because it no longer binds you. You no longer carry it as a wound. You carry it as wisdom. The awakened heart is not above the world. It is deeply rooted in it. It walks gently, speaks carefully, listens fully. It is not perfect. It forgets, falls, remembers again. But it does not panic. It returns, always returns. And perhaps most humbling of all, it understands that freedom is not personal. It is not yours to possess. It is something that flows through you, like wind through a field, like light through a window. When you are still and open, it moves. When you close, it waits. This kind of freedom does not need to be declared. It is lived. In the way you look at a stranger, in the way you pick up a piece of trash, in the way you bow to suffering, not as a defeat, but as a dance. You become the presence that transforms the moment, not because you try, but because you are empty of resistance, full of space. And in that spaciousness, life moves freely, gracefully, lovingly. That is the end of suffering, not because life no longer hurts, but because you are no longer caught. Not because you have escaped impermanence, but because you are no longer afraid of it. You breathe, you smile, you rest in the vastness of now, and the world, just as it is, becomes enough.